Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janine Wendt. I'm the Executive Director of HECCMA, which stands for the Higher Education Consortium of Central Massachusetts. We're glad to have so many people here today, and we're hoping to have more in the next few minutes. We are recording this session, so if you wouldn't mind just putting a button on mute, and also if you are not a requested speaker, if you could shut off your video to make sure that you are not inadvertently shown on the screen when you don't expect it. We will have time a little bit later for questions. And at that time, we're going to ask, instead of having you pop on the mic, that you actually put your questions in the chat. And now I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, Garland Mann-Lamb from MCPHS University. Garland.
Hello all, my name is Garland Mann-Lamb, as Janine had just said, and I'm the Director of Campus Life here at MCPHS in downtown Worcester. We're very excited to put this on behalf of Constitution Day, and also National Voter Registration Day is today. So if you've been on Google, I'm sure you've seen the little doodle there. So to get started, I'm going to have everyone introduce themselves, and we're going to do the popcorn effect, where I will start with one person, then you can pass it to the next. So Julia, if you want to mention your name, pronouns, and where you're from.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. My name is Julia. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the communications organizer for the Massachusetts Voter Table. And I'll pass it to Vanessa.
Hello, everyone. My name is Vanessa Snow, and I'm the Director of Policy and Organizing at MassVote. Pass it to Ann.
Hi, I'm Ann Lisi. I am a volunteer board member with the Worcester Area League of Women Voters, and I am the former executive director of the Greater Worcester Community Foundation. Gina.
My apologies. Hi, everyone. My name is Gina Platanino, pronouns she, her, ella. I am an attorney with Mass Law Reform Institute, where I focus on legislative policy. And I will turn it over to Najia.
Hi, I'm Najia, she, her pronouns. I'm a Clark University sophomore, student moderator on this panel, and the treasurer of the Clark U Democrats Club on campus. Oh, and pass it to Janine. Has Janine gone yet?
Yes.
Oh, then great.
All right. So thank you all for coming. As you mentioned, we'll have some time at the end for some questions from our audience. And we do have a good list here. So maybe some of those will be covered, but feel free anytime during while anyone is talking to share any additional questions in the chat, and we will definitely get to those. So to get us started, Anne, I'm going to throw it to you. So what does the Constitution say about voting?
Well, this is a great question. We're thinking about Make Your Plan to Vote, which is the title of the workshop, where it's incumbent on every person who's a citizen of voting age to take advantage of the franchise that has been so hard fought. Every year there's an election. Every year is an election year. In many cities, there's more than one election opportunity to vote. So making your plan to vote is something that we take responsibility for in exchange for the rights given to us. The Constitution, I'm not a scholar or anything like that, but it says actually very little about voting. Article 2 describes how the President of the United States will be elected, and it will be on the second Tuesday of November. That's in the Constitution. It was picked because it's a season in between harvest, before winter. The white men, landowners who needed to trot into the county polling place would be able to take time to do that, second Tuesday of November. Beyond that, it lays out various things about the numbers of how the Senate and the US House will be formed. But we've had to have constitutional amendments to expand the franchise, 15 breaking down the barrier for men of any color, of any race. 19th Amendment for women to vote. But the 26th Amendment had to come along to take away the poll tax. Because of course, in the Jim Crow South after Reconstruction, you know the story, so many barriers put up for voting. So in fact, voting is managed by states. That's why it can feel a little confusing, and people feel a lot of perchance hesitation or I guess I'll say confusion. But Congress has passed other laws that the Voting Rights Act of 1965, of course, which broke down more barriers. So the Constitution is our friend in regards to saying that we shall elect our representatives. But apart from that, it has left it up to Congress and states to pass amendments and states to run the thing. So look to your state secretaries and your local clerks. They are your friends in making your plan to vote. If anyone wants to add anything else, Garland, to that little lecture.
And so so I always like to say this, that the Constitution is the floor, not the ceiling, right?
Nice.
So, which is also gets us to some of the questions we're gonna answer later, right? States have the power to make this as accessible as they want to, or also as burdensome and create as many obstacles as possible. But always remember that it's always the floor, not the ceiling. So there's always room to go either way.
Nice add, Gina.
Thank you both. That's makes sense about the harvest, but is not something I would have ever thought about now in our time. So, all right. So the next big one that we will get to is how does one register to vote?
Great question. So in Massachusetts, there are a couple of ways that you can go and register to vote. If you have a Massachusetts driver's license, you can actually register online. It's very easy. You don't have to print anything out. You can just do it all online. But if you, like me, do not have a Massachusetts driver's license, you are going to be able to register to vote by printing out a form and filling out some very basic information. So like your name, your address, what party you want to register for, some very basic things that I promise you, you will know the answer to. I'm putting a link in the chat to registertovotema.com. That is the website you can go to register for the first time, to update your registration if you've changed your name, if you've moved, or if maybe you want to change your party that you vote in. You can do that all there. And maybe you're not sure if you're registered to vote. You can go to that website and check to see if you're registered and if that registration is up to date. So I want to encourage everybody during or after this panel to go to registertovotema.com and just double check that you're registered to vote if you haven't already, or if you're just unsure. If you are registering for the first time in Massachusetts, you can go ahead and click on that, fill out the form and print it out, and then you'll mail it into your town hall, and then you'll be registered to vote in your town. There are a few different ways that you can vote once you're registered. You can vote in person on election day, you can vote early in person, and you can vote by mail. Anne is going to talk about that a little bit later, I believe. But that's just kind of what we're thinking about right now as we're starting to make that plan to vote. As you start to register, you have to make sure that you're thinking about that now, because the deadline to register to vote is October 29th, which means that you have to start thinking about that now so that you can make your plan to register and then make your plan to vote one of the three options. Yeah, anybody have anything else to add?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to direct the next question at Vanessa and Gina. Why do you believe it's important for college students to vote? What's that demographics importance, and why would you encourage college students to vote?
Well, one, it is a huge demographic in the United States, but it is very underrepresented in local and national government. You see we have congressmen and senators that are in their 80s and may not understand the problems of today. And the way how we get representatives to understand the issues that we're dealing with is by holding them accountable via the vote. I think also when you're in college, you're in an interesting point in your life, in that, you know, you have access to so much information and so many different points of views. You know, you might be part of organizations, or you take a government class, and a lot of people who aren't in that day-to-day experience, you know, are really relying on commercials, or even have very little information or access to information. So I think you as people who are getting your education, I think really have an interesting perspective. You know, students who might be studying biology or environmental science should be voting on these issues. And so you know, you can be talking with your friends. Adulthood can sometimes be a very isolating and lonely place. And I think also, you know, the earlier you start voting, you'll be voting for the rest of your life. And so I think it's important to incorporate that into your annual schedule. And why not start now?
Great, Vanessa. And I just want to add, you know, specifically there's something that Vanessa said about the demographics of who's representing us. They don't necessarily look like you or me by many ways. Like, we're not going to get into the details. And they didn't go to college with the same student loans that we did. Okay. They went to college where it was basically free. The moment that we passed the Civil Rights Act, the moment that there was a push for equity to allow more women, to allow people of color into colleges, the funding from the federal government and from the state to public and private universities went down dramatically. Okay. So just sort of think about that your experience is not necessarily like theirs. You're graduating with a lot of zeros, a lot of debt. I'll give you an example. When the bankruptcy code was when they were redoing their bankruptcy code, and this is why it matters, because you can't discharge student loans, right? And you know who was at the table? Credit card companies. Banks were at the table. Were college students at the table? Were people like you and me at the table? No, we weren't. This is why it's so important for college students to go ahead and vote, because you, by the time, yes, I might become in, you know, my 40s and my 50s, a lot of the decisions would have already been made. And you want people to hear you. So you're graduating so you can get jobs, access to housing, affordable housing, access to childcare, access to all of these things. The time is now.
Thank you so much for those responses. And anybody else has any feedback on that point, please feel free to say that. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to jump in with something that I found out recently, is that there are almost 500,000 college students in Massachusetts. So when you think about the huge amount of young people who are currently in college, who are just graduated from college, who all have these shared experiences that Gina was talking about, we are a huge voting bloc in Massachusetts. And it is so important in our state to make our voices heard on the issues that are really impacting us. And so it's not just you as an individual, it's not just you and your 5 friends, but it's 500,000 people who are in the same situation. And we need to be voting with each other and for each other.
Wow, that's an incredible amount of students. So thank you for sharing that with us, Julia. All right, so still on the topic of college student voting. So why should someone consider voting in their home state versus Massachusetts, where they go to school, or, you know, if they're sharing this with their friends who go to school somewhere else? And Vanessa,
I can start. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I find this question really interesting because you know, I was born and raised and went to college in Massachusetts, so I never had to think about you know, if I wanted to vote absentee or in the state that I reside in, what would matter. And I think you have to think about, you know, what are the issues that matter to you, and like maybe make a calculated decision as to where your vote counts the most. So we'll talk about what's on the ballot in Massachusetts in a little bit, But I know that if like my family lived in Michigan, reproductive rights are on the ballot this year. And so I might want to consider casting my vote there. You know, if I lived in Texas, you know, that is a swing state, and you know, there are some important elections all the way down the ballot there. And so, you know, you have to kind of think about it. But as we talk about what's on the ballot in Massachusetts, you know, whether or not you're registered to vote here, you're living here for the next few years. You know, you rely on public transportation, you know, you rely on public safety. This economy might be the job force that you're trying to enter in after graduating. And so these are all different topics that you would want to consider. I also know that different states have different rules when it comes to absentee voting or registering to vote online. One great thing about Massachusetts is that we actually expanded our voter registration period. So now you're able to register to vote 10 days before the election, which I know in New York State, it's actually a much more cumbersome process to register to vote. We also have 10 days of early voting leading up to the election. And so if you wanted to vote on the weekend, there's going to be 2 weekends of early voting too. So I think voting in Massachusetts, I think, you know, we hear about the voter suppression that happens all over the country, and not to say that those barriers to the ballot don't exist for everybody here, but you know, I think we've been doing a lot of work as advocates and our local government to make our elections accessible and fair. And so that's also another thing to consider about and where you're voting. You know, what's on the ballot, what resonates with your values, where do you think your vote would make most of an impact? In Massachusetts, some local elections are decided with under 50 votes, especially like in local years. I think this past primary, we only had 20% of the state's eligible voters voting in this election. And so local politics, I think especially in Massachusetts, where we see nationally we lean blue, you know, it's a lot more nuanced at the local level, and I would say your voice matters a lot more.
Along that vein, the vote that counts the most is the vote that is cast. So if you are thinking about voting absentee, maybe you're from a different state, but you haven't really looked into the deadlines or the process on how to vote absentee, do that right now. Do that today. If you want to vote in your home state, do it as soon as possible. Otherwise, vote in Massachusetts. It doesn't matter where you vote. I mean, a lot of times it does matter. And if you are from a place where maybe your vote feels really important, absolutely go and cast your vote in your home state. But make sure that you cast your vote, whether it is there or here. The important thing is that you actually exercise that right.
Thank you for all that insight. That was really, really important. I think local elections have always been crucial, but with the Supreme Court and various rights being turned back to state levels, it's getting more and more important to be aware of that. So moving on to directing this at Julia, what are the ballot questions in Massachusetts this year, and why is it important to know the questions and do your research before you go into the voting booth?
Absolutely. So I often can find myself looking at my ballot and get really confused. Sometimes there are some smaller races that I haven't heard a lot about, and I'm looking at this ballot and I'm like, who the heck are these people? How would I possibly know who to vote for? This is so random and niche. I don't know any of this information. And that often is like times 10 when it comes to ballot questions. because there just isn't a lot of like easily digestible information out there. You might be hearing some conflicting things. And overall, it's a very confusing process. And sometimes it's designed intentionally to be confusing so that we throw our hands in the air and we give up and we don't vote on that question. We only vote for the thing that we know about. Maybe it's the governor's race that you've heard a lot about. So you only fill in that bubble and you leave the rest of the bubbles blank. I want to make sure that we are all educated voters and people who know what's going to be on our ballot and feel confident going into the voting booth. A couple of ways, just tangible ways before I talk about what's on the ballot to do that, is I find it really helpful to request a mail ballot so that I can, when I get my mail ballot, I can see what my ballot actually looks like. And then maybe I'll vote in person on election day or early voting, but I know exactly what it's going to look like. I know who the people are, and I can familiarize myself with it before I go in. You also have the right, in an in-person voting place, you have the right to bring any materials into the polling booth that you want. So if you want to bring in some campaign information, if you want to bring in a cheat sheet that you wrote for yourself, you are allowed to do that so that you have all the information at your fingertips and you remember all the stuff that you've looked at before, because we're all educated voters. So the question is about the ballot questions. There are some local ballot questions. There's one in Worcester that will be finalized soon and will be on the Worcester website at most in a couple of weeks. It should be up there fairly soon. There are also 4 statewide ballot questions that you'll be voting on in November. So question 1 is the Fair Share Amendment. This is a ballot question which would make a 4% surtax on incomes over $1 million and constitutionally dedicate that money towards public education and transportation in Massachusetts. Question 2 is about dental insurance. And a yes vote would require dental insurers to spend at least 88% of revenue on patient care. Question 3 is a very convoluted question, which honestly I have spent a lot of time decoding, but it is about liquor licenses in retail stores. So it would decrease the number of full liquor licenses allowed for business from 9 to 7, increase beer and wine licenses from 9 to 18. It prohibits self-checkout of alcohol. It makes the fines for selling alcohol to a minor based on all total sales, not just alcohol sales. And it allows for out-of-state IDs to be relied upon as proof of age. So that's 5 things for question 3. And then question 4 is a vote about driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. There was a law that was passed this summer called the Work and Family Mobility Act, which allows Massachusetts residents to take a driver's test, get a driver's license, and buy insurance in Massachusetts, regardless of their immigration status. That is being challenged in a ballot question. So a yes vote upholds the law and a no vote repeals the law. To give some more context here, at the Massachusetts voter table, we have endorsed a yes vote on questions 1 and 4. So that's on the ballot. That's on the Fair Share Amendment and the driver's license questions. And we have not endorsed questions 2 and 3. As you can see from my explanation, question 3 is very confusing to me still. But if you have any questions about that later, I can put some links in the chat to help you look at those resources.
I always find the hardest thing about the ballot questions is understanding them. I remember there was one in, I think it was 2018, and I was like, I'm for this, but you had to actually, similar to what you're saying, yes is to uphold or no. And I was like, oh no, I'm not against that. So thank you for explaining those. All right. So I'm going to move us down a little bit. So Gina, can you tell us how students can become civically involved beyond, just casting their vote?
Sure. I will start with the people on this panel could be great resources for you. You've heard a lot of people talking about issues. Find something that you're passionate about. We talked about a ballot question. You don't even have to work on that. Maybe you're really passionate about puppies and you want to make sure that every dog is a happy dog, right? So maybe you will start working on that campaign to make sure that every dog in Massachusetts is a happy dog. It doesn't have to, like, no, people think politics and it's like, oh, politics and civic engagement are two different things. Civic engagement is you as a resident, as someone who lives here, wants to have an input on what your community looks like, right? I go back to affordable housing, right? Can you afford to have an apartment, right? Maybe that's what you're going to be civically engaged in. If you're a college student, which is what we are now, your school has a lot of resources where you can cheat and skip a lot of these steps and say, what campaigns are going on right now that I want to support? And there are so many things. There's fun things you could do. You can go stand with a couple of people and hold a sign and say, make Massachusetts better for dogs, right? Or you can call your legislator, your elected official, and say, I live in Worcester and I want to make sure that inclusionary zoning passes for people who make $45,000, not $70,000, because I'm not going to make that, right? You can do that. 30 seconds call, it makes a difference, because here's why. At the local level, you call 4 phone calls, people pay attention. At the state level, 7 phone calls. There's 500,000 of you here in Massachusetts. Imagine the power that you have if you start calling your legislators and say, I support X issue. So there are many ways. Definitely take note of the people on this panel, speak to the people in your schools. And there are so many coalitions. If you're in Worcester, I'll put my email. If you care about housing, food security, equity, health disparities, happy to chat about those things.
Thank you.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much. I personally am very attached to the dog argument. That sounds great. I would love to make this world a better place for all dogs. Just to direct this at Anne, how can we make voting more accessible for everybody?
Well, the framing of the question sort of feels like voting doesn't feel accessible for everybody. So I'm empathetic to that. I will say that many reforms have already been made in Massachusetts, and there's work being done that the League of Women Voters and so many other advocacy nonprofits have promoted. But first of all, the reforms that we took under during the pandemic, mail-in voting. It used to be called absentee ballot, and you had to have a reason. I'm out of the country that day, or it turns out I'm in the hospital that day. So you quickly either emergency or plan ahead. Well, mail-in ballots are the norm in 2 states, Oregon and I think another. Massachusetts now made no excuse mail-in voting, okay? So it's the same word. It's basically getting your ballot in advance, filling it out. You can walk it in on election day, or you can walk it in early voting days, or you can put it in the mail, or you can drop it in a drop box. So all that is under the category of mail-in voting. But the reforms that that's one of the very important reforms. It's also maybe a future question we're going to talk about. In this moment, we have all this argument about that's filled with, and I'm using air quotes here for the audio recording, there are fraudulent claims that that is problematic. It is not. High integrity with it. In Worcester, by the way, most communities in Massachusetts have a drop box at the clerk's office. Worcester has that, plus 10 fire stations have drop boxes. So accessible voting that way. Another is automatic voter registration. That was passed by law in 2020, so that if you conduct a transaction with the Registry of Motor Vehicles or with a state agency like Mass Health or Commonwealth Health Connector, you're automatically registered to vote. So that's why we say check your registration status. You may already be registered. So, but the big reforms, and there are advocacy groups, including the League and many others, that have an array of things that actually wrapped into this freedom, the John Lewis Freedom to Vote Act, which passed the House, installed in the Senate, and just dropped last year, right? But I'm just going to say everybody agrees. Everybody who's working on democracy and strengthening democracy, which voting is a key portion of, agree that there's a list of things, and they fall into 3 categories. They are in the category of making registration, the opportunities to register more obvious, making voting easier. Some would say make it a national holiday on a Saturday. There's even a discussion of making it an obligation. If it was an absolute requirement, then a lot of the partisan fighting would have to go away, because there would be a law to make sure you can do it. Australia has. But I can put this up. The Carnegie Corporation of New York, which is a foundation, has funded research into this. So the 3rd category would be making election administration nonpartisan and professionalized, essentially trying to create 50 states with norms across the states. But in any event, my summary is a lot of the things that have been pleaded for to make voting more accessible have been adopted in Massachusetts. The one thing we didn't adopt was same-day voter registration. So we still have this deadline of I guess it's October 29th or something like that. So 9 days. Is it 10 days, ladies, and the expertise?
10 days. And one thing about same-day voter registration is that so that would be really helpful. Like sometimes you might go to the wrong polling place, right, or you may have changed your address between the last time you voted and you show up. You can't be denied the right to vote, but they will often give you a provisional ballot. And so that provisional ballot, it doesn't get counted on election day. You're expected within 48 hours to go to the elections department, follow up with whatever proof of address you need. That's pretty burdensome. So moving towards election day registration or voter election day registration or same day registration would get rid of this provisional ballot system. And in the 2020 election in Massachusetts, half of those ballots were actually discarded. That's a couple thousand votes that weren't counted that day. And so supporting same-day voter registration, we don't have it yet. Many states do, but we're hoping in the next couple of years, in the next legislative session, we'll be able to get it.
Thank you, Vanessa. So I guess I want people to feel like, in fact, challenge that piece of personal assumption that feels like voting is difficult. 2018 voter turnout was the largest in United States history. We can do it again. And 2020 was also quite large. So people are voting despite feelings of barriers and actual barriers. But yeah, the provisional ballot, if the voter ID is another category of could be a barrier. In Massachusetts, it's not a picture ID that's required. It is proof of your you don't actually have to have an ID to walk into the polling booth. But if you're presenting a provisional ballot, you're uncertain, you're not on the list, you'd like to, somehow your name isn't appearing, but you want to cast a ballot. Correct me if I'm wrong after I say this, but something that has your address with your name, like a utility bill. So don't let them intimidate you. There are friends that can go with you to vote. But we're pretty lucky to be in Massachusetts with some of the reforms that have come out.
Yeah, I'm really excited that we actually have 2 weekends of early voting this upcoming election. Right. So, a Saturday or a Sunday, 2 weeks before the election, folks are going to have an opportunity to vote. And to me, that just sounds so accessible. Like, no excuses why you won't be able to vote.
Really.
One of the things, even to go back to the earlier question of becoming, civically involved, something that I did last year was volunteer to be a poll worker, which was a really cool experience. I had no idea what to expect, but that's a really good way to serve your community, and it was really cool to see all of these things play out, what a provisional ballot was, to learn all about, you know, the rights of voters. So that was really interesting. So I encourage you all, if you're in somewhere, to look into being a poll worker. It's very, you know, it's one day and you get to say you did it. And it's very cool. Also, you get to see a little printout. They sit on the door of like everyone's initial vote from your location. Very fun. All right, so Gina, I'm going to direct this question to you. So what can candidates who are running for office or current elected officials do to inspire their constituents to vote?
Show up. I would say that's the first one. Show up in spaces where community actually is. Talk to voters. You'd be surprised and how many, you know, it's a circle. Well, I'm not going to go visit, you know, that particular district or that particular place because they never vote. Well, they don't vote because you never visit, right? Like, so it's not the responsibility of the voters to go seek you out. You're the elected official who is trying to get people's votes, and you're trying to represent a large constituency, not just certain constituencies. So I would say the first one is just show up, be transparent as to your policies, and engage with people as to their needs, right? We have that, what we're doing right now. There are so many ways now with social media that elected officials can become more accessible. I think AOC is a perfect example. Everybody knows what she's doing all the time, right? But even if not on social media, where are they and in what spaces? Are they attending community meetings? Are they at the place when there's an emergency? COVID changed things dramatically, right? It allowed for a lot of legislative briefings. It allowed for a lot of community meetings to go virtual, which is a good and a bad thing for a plethora of reasons. Are they showing in those spaces where people are? I think overall, I keep saying the word showing up, becoming more involved, and also keeping people abreast, right? So it's not just, hi, vote for me, but you voted for me, and this is how I'm working as to the platform that I set out to make sure that happen. And keeping people, again, abreast of like, this is how we're moving, right? There's a large bill right now, the econ bill. Are our elected officials going to go back in session to discuss this? We don't know, right? So letting community know, like, oh, I didn't know there was this large bill with X amount of money, explaining it to constituents so that they can be more involved. It's not as complicated as it seems. And even when we talk about legislative sessions, like, what does that even mean? Really breaking it down and saying, look, this is the amount of time that we have to work on this particular language. Just making things as simple and as approachable and as many languages as possible so that we can outreach to as many people as well.
Thank you so much for that analysis and understanding. I think being with the community is so crucial, and so many people are so separate and not involved in their precincts and their districts that people don't even realize who's representing them. So thank you for that. And for everybody, you know, as our final question, how does our current moment, this current political, economic moment, fit into the broader history of voting in the United States? Anybody can kick off. Yeah, go ahead.
I think you're looking at me with my mic off. I consider it a backlash moment. We have expanded rights to everybody now. Some would say 14-year-olds should be allowed, so that's probably the next frontier, is lowering the age. But just saying, never have so many people been eligible, and the state legislators and governors, because that's who controls this thing, who wish to have that not be the case, who want there to be gerrymandering, who do not want there to be turnout, are offering wicked ways to manage that agenda. And so at the same time, I feel we have a better educated populace, a more engaged populace. The boomer class is large and the Gen Z class is large. You have large swaths of dedicated citizens who aren't going to sit down for this. And the ages in between. I'm just giving you sort of a big picture. So to me, we have backlash on top of high skill set to not stand for junk. So I love the clash because I think the voters are going to win this and turn out. And some say we can get to 70% turnout if we try. Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah, I mean,
Vanessa?
we're some folks say that we're on the other side of a pandemic. I'm not quite feel that way, but the last few years, I think we've seen how the government has stepped up or how they've fallen short in getting us through this thing. We're also in our planet is dying. We have natural disasters that are coming more and more frequently, and we really need our government to listen to our voices when it comes to that. As a college student, I went to a state school. I graduated with a lot of student debt, and now we see that the national government is responding to that crisis. Maybe not going far enough, but we really got to see what the government can do when it needs, how the government can help us, how the government can hurt us. As we see people's bodily autonomy up for a vote in other states, people's right to marry, things like that, people's right to drive safely is on the ballot. And so, I think these issues matter. They really do affect our day-to-day lives. And the only voice we have right now is our vote. It's been a very long time since there's been a national strike or like, God forbid, a civil war. This is a peaceful way to let our voices be heard. And so, I think every election is crucial to the future of all of our futures. So very important time to vote.
Thank you. If anyone on the call today has any additional questions for our panelists, feel free to put them in the chat. And I just want to say thank you to everyone on the call for joining us today, and especially our students from Clark who shared some of our questions and came up with them. The whole reason that we're here is to really engage our college students in and outside of the city. And I think the ways in which we do that are apparent from having some of you on this call. So thank you very much.
I also want to thank Garland Van Lam for agreeing to be our moderator on behalf of HECCMA colleges. So bravo to you, bravo to all of our panelists, and thank you all for your time.